Jaime, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
You are the first Mi'kmaq member of parliament, and I wonder how your experiences representing your community. You're already the chair of our Liberal Indigenous Caucus, and so obviously these issues matter to you deeply as well. Greg Fergus just asked a question of the commissioner of the RCMP to identify systemic racism and asked whether it existed and said, can you provide some examples? And she had a tough time. I imagine you're not going to have such a tough time.
One of the things that we really have to start off with when we start off our conversation in Canada is that it didn't start, 152 years ago. Mi'kmaq people have been living in this area for a recorded up to 13,000 years. Our country is based on the premise that when people came to North America, they signed treaties with nations that were already here saying that this is how we see the country moving forward. And these are our shared treaties, whether you're an Indigenous person or whether you're a new immigrant or if your family moved here 300 years ago, the whole foundation of Canada is based on these treaties. And Greg Fergus really has inspired me to start reaching out. And we have in Nova Scotia a minister, a Black MLA named Tony Ince, who I've been talking with for about 2 weeks, and we're saying that between the provincial Liberal governments, between the federal Liberal governments, what is the action? Everyone talks about what is the action that we need to take? And we started having this conversation, and we're going to have a forum within Nova Scotia. We don't know the mechanism yet, whether it's going to be Zoom, whether they're going to allow us to do it in person, but really to explore these next steps that we can take, because there's so many things that we need to do to address racism, to address change. But the biggest thing is, I think, education. My previous job before becoming into politics was the treaty education lead for Nova Scotia. And what I was able to do was go around across Nova Scotia and to talk to judges, talk to RCMPs, talk to the school, change the curriculum and say, we want it to reflect who Indigenous people are. We wanted to have a balanced understanding of this moving forward. And they're doing some great work in other places like Saskatchewan and Manitoba. But I always remember the words of an elder there who had gone to a residential school. And I found it so profound when he said, if you want treaty education to succeed, if you want your initiative to succeed, your message has to be about moving forward together. It can't be about resent. It can't be about guilt. It can't be about shame. It's about how do we move forward together in a way that every Canadian can get behind, every Nova Scotian can get behind and say, we understand your history and we're going to strive to do better. And that's the Canada Day that I believe in.
We know that outcomes are unequal today, specifically because of the historical racism and discrimination against Indigenous communities. And we can talk about, and Greg rightly highlights discrimination and historical racism and systemic racism today as a result for our Black communities in Canada as well. And so when we talk about moving forward together, I think that's the right way of bringing people together once we've identified the seriousness of this, and to say, let's move forward and improve the situation for the communities that have suffered as a result of really cultural genocide, people have been right to say. Education, I think, makes absolute sense. And I guess I've been seized with this. I can't get out of my head this idea of economic justice and making sure that if we see differential outcomes, it's because of the social determinants. And if we want to address the social determinants, education is a key part of that, but also basic income supports to make sure people don't live in poverty has to be a significant part of that as well.
And I think you're on the right track. I've had a lot of different jobs in my life. I was a professor at Cape Breton University. I worked for the Mi'kmaq in terms of identifying citizenship. And one of the things that in my citizenship research, because they always talk about indigeneity in terms of blood. Are you half Mi'kmaq? Are you full? This is something that I've gotten my whole life because of my pale complexion. That's always a question to me. What percentage of you is Indigenous? In a Mi'kmaq community called Eskasoni, which has 5,000 members. But one of the things I during that citizenship research that I want to go back to is that race is a cultural phenomenon. It's not biological. There's nothing within our blood or in our DNA that has any relevance towards race. And one of the problematic things is mitochondrial DNA. It only picks up your mother's genetics. So they're discounting, if you're looking at your great grandfather, the only thing that they're looking at is your mother's mother's mother. It doesn't take into consideration that. So it's just such a flawed system. And the reason I bring that up is because it makes it clear that as humans, we're 99.9% the same. And the only difference is the opportunities that we're given growing up. Now, as a Mi'kmaq person, I can be one of the only Mi'kmaq persons who say I understand and enjoy white privilege because I have blonde hair, green eyes, pale complexion, and in my community, growing up, that wasn't a good thing. You get teased, called an albino, you got called powder cast, all of these things. But then when I was older, I realized that I wasn't getting the same treatment as my friends who'd walk into a restaurant or walk into a store and people would have their eyes on them, or in hotels when we used to play hockey tournaments. But I really never, saw it as an obstacle until I wanted to run for the Liberal Party. And, I'd go around asking some people for support. And I had one gentleman tell me very frankly, I like you. I think you're a smart person. I just don't think Sydney's progressive enough to vote in a Native person.
Wow.
And I was like, you know what? I was actually thankful. I said, you know what? I thank you for your honesty on there, but I'm going to bust my ass to prove you wrong. And I have. But it's one of these things that where do we go from here? And that's the question. And that's where the more MPs are having this conversation, the more we're doing it. And the thing is, let's have it in a safe space.
I think there are two important approaches where one is focused on education for the sake of people who are growing up, and we want to ensure that whatever household they're growing up in and whatever the views of parents or grandparents, we're teaching people about equality and dignity, and that the different colors of our skin, the different religious beliefs that people might have, the different cultural backgrounds that people have are not reasons to treat people differently. I think there's an importance of just educating people about, just the importance of respect and equality fundamentally is what it comes down to. And then the other element is a matter of justice to ensure that we rectify past wrongs, and that idea that you've identified of moving forward together. So we move forward together by educating one another about different experiences and respecting and trying to, stand in other people's shoes. But we also move forward together by ensuring that people do have the same kinds of opportunities going forward. And that requires economic justice. It requires greater self-government in some ways. And so education is one piece, but then we also enter into another conversation about government policies that are going to start lifting individuals themselves up who are coming from communities that have been wronged in the past. And do you have a sense of, we could go down a road of basic income supports in some ways, or we could go down the road of housing supports, or we could go down the road of ensuring that there are great social supports there. And then in terms of self-government, there's the conversation we're having about UNDRIP. And I hope we see legislation tabled in the fall if we return to some sense of normalcy. You've made some interesting comments in caucus, given it was your dad's history with the negotiations, but there's another avenue that I think we have to seriously act on in the coming months.
Yeah, you touched on a lot of things, and I want to get back to the economic and accommodation pieces towards where we can go in this country. But for UNDRIP, my history with that is my father began working for the Mi'kmaq Nation back in early 1980s. And at that time, they were trying to have the constitutional talks. And as part of that, they didn't allow Mi'kmaq to have their own seat. They had the Assembly of First Nations at the time at the table, and the Mi'kmaq leadership said, well, we didn't give them the right to discuss our rights on our behalf. And so they went to the United Nations and said that Canada continues to violate our treaties and not have these discussions with us. So my father, as well as one of his best friends from Harvard, represented the Mi'kmaq for free and at the United Nations, and went to one of the political covenants and said to the committee is that Canada has violated our right as peoples to self-determination. So after an 8-year back and forth between Canada gets to write their side, it's not like a court system. It's like Canada gets to respond to their claim. They got to respond to Canada's claim. And after 8 years, the group that was listening to the conversation said, we understand what you're saying, that the Mi'kmaq do have this right to self-determination. We don't have a mechanism within this covenant to change that. We don't have the authority to do something about that. So after that, my father, as well as Russell Barsh, he was one of the kind of the founders of a political forum in United Nations for Indigenous People. They started writing the first clause of what they would now be UNDRIP, saying all peoples have the right to self-determination. Because one of the arguments that was used in the 1990s, not 1890s, is that Indigenous people weren't peoples according to the laws of United Nations. What UNDRIP was meant to do was give Indigenous peoples globally the same rights as ever other human beings. Because in South America, which really pushed against UNDRIP, these were people who said that Indigenous people were pagans and heathens and couldn't have the same rights as everyone else. And so this was really part of a global kind of movement to say that Indigenous people should enjoy the same rights as everyone else.
We have different levels of consultation required depending upon the seriousness of the imposition upon Indigenous communities according to existing law. And do you think that UNDRIP will move the needle to a stronger degree of consultation and consent, or do you think that this will in some ways simply codify the case law that we've seen?
I think it has more bearing within the case law and future case law in terms of what Indigenous communities are asking is the same right as any other Canadian. If we were to build a railway through your riding that would displace many communities, those communities would have a right to have a voice in how our government moves forward, whether it's a train, whether it's a pipeline, whether it's anything that's out there that the government's moving forward on, that Indigenous people should enjoy the same protections and right that every other Canadian would enjoy in that situation.
In some cases, then, if the project is in the public interest, my home, for example, could be expropriated so long as I'm reasonably compensated. The idea there is, but still I would have to be engaged, I'd have to be consulted, I would have to ultimately be compensated if we couldn't come to an agreement, but the government still wanted to move forward. Is that the idea?
I believe so. I just, that reasonable compensation piece and consultation piece is where I think people get too much focus on saying, well, it's a veto. I think it's just the amount of, you want the ability to be able to go to a community, whether it's Indigenous or non-Indigenous, and say, here's what we need to happen. Here's what the benefits going to be, and here how you're going to be reasonably compensated for this.
And ensuring there's a legal protection so that the government can't simply foist a level of compensation or terms and conditions on a particular community, and the community does not have recourse, that there's protection in the law for the community to defend their rights in court.
Yeah, and if you look at the early case law, I don't know if you remember from law school, the St. Catharines Milling case, it describes as Indigenous land ownership as what they call a usufructory right. That means we have the right to enjoy the land, but there's no real ownership of it. And that's problematic in many areas for a government to say, well, you don't really own the land, you just get to live there based on the Crown believing that it's fair to allow, the Indigenous people to roam on their communities. And I think that's where we need to have more discussion on that. And I think that that's where the UNDRIP is able to take that case law from Indigenous people having a mere usage of land to actual ownership where they can be reasonably compensated. And the government's still going to move ahead on projects. We still need to get things done. But the biggest thing is to be able to have that conversation on equal footing as every other Canadian. That's the key part.
The debate ultimately centers around this, you've discussed it as a veto, but this notion of free, prior, and informed consent, and whether one has to obtain free, prior, and informed consent, or one has to enter into good faith negotiations in order to obtain free, prior, and informed consent. And even if one can't obtain that consent, if the project is in the public interest and the engagement has been in good faith and there is reasonable compensation on the table, then the debate is whether the consent has to have been obtained or sought and compensated for.
Yeah, and I think that's where UNDRIP helps case law in a case-by-case situation determine that, because you can't make a pan-Indigenous approach to There are some sites that are more significant than others, and some, access to water is important things. Access to your community's hunting ground, these have to be reflected. I think that it's tough to understand a lot of these concepts, but more and more there are more Indigenous people going to law school. There are more Indigenous judges out there, and I think that the conversation is being had. And for me personally, when I want to come back to accommodation, and one of the things that we had in Nova Scotia was the Donald Marshall Jr. inquiry, where Donald Marshall spent 11 years in prison for a crime that he didn't commit, and afterwards they had an inquiry that said that our justice system was just so racist at the time that needed to be changed. And as a part of that, the Dalhousie Law School put aside 12 spots every single year for Indigenous, Black, and Mi'kmaq people. And I'm one of those people who was given the ability to go to law school because they made room for us. And because of that, I was able to get my law degree and go into academia right away. And now I'm a member of parliament. But if not for that accommodation, by not for given that opportunity, I may not be in this seat I am in today.
And there are accommodations like the one that you describe, where you were given a particular opportunity, and to succeed in a way that would not have been afforded to your parents at Dalhousie Law School. When it comes to the criminal justice numbers or the foster care numbers, so much of that is tied to a lack of opportunity, which is tied to poverty. And I wonder how we distribute resources. There are a couple of challenges with getting dollars into people's hands outside of the tax system. And so we're largely limited in delivering dollars through the tax system itself, and that presents challenges. But do you see this idea of economic justice? I have talked about it in caucus and elsewhere as needing to expand and redesign the CERB so it provides really a guaranteed income supplement for seniors, but for all Canadians. I don't know if you support that, or if you would look to other ways of lifting people up and addressing economic justice.
I'm very interested in the term of how we do that. I live in a community that's 75% children in poverty, and to me, it's we have the welfare system, but what we really want is to create meaningful job and meaningful employment. And I'm trying to figure out, where do these people land when it comes to giving people a general basic income? And how do we ensure that those who need help are getting the help? And if you look at the CERB, I've had chiefs call me from Ontario telling me, Jaime, this is a real challenge for us because you have these drug dealers making people go on the CERB to pay off their debts. And it's making the situation worse. And I've heard from people up north that say, everyone's on this, and we've got to do something about it because it's making the problems around addictions and a little worse, with now an influx of money when people didn't have money before. I'd like to see more on the details, but an influx of money into an area that has major social challenges, I don't know yet if I'm convinced that that's the solution. And I'd love to hear your comments on it, though.
Yeah, so there are no doubt people who will take some incoming money and use it in a way that, if they have engaged in conduct that is harmful to themselves and they're dealing with mental health challenges, the influx of money may well go to those same ends. But if you look to the child poverty rate that you mentioned, and you look to something like the Canada Child Benefit, did you hear the same concerns about the Canada Child Benefit? Because the Canada Child Benefit has helped lift 300,000 kids out of poverty, right? And so, absolutely. And that is a direct cash transfer into people's bank accounts. And we see the lowest poverty rate among any demographic in this country is seniors. And why is that? Because the federal government spends $55 billion a year in direct cash transfers through old age security and the guaranteed income supplement. And so do you see the seniors in your community that are filing their income taxes and receiving GIS, OAS? Are they happy to receive it? I bet they are. And so I think for those who are receiving a CERB-like benefit and using it in a destructive way, I think the answer there is not to remove those funds, but the answer is to ensure that we are addressing those needs and that destructive behavior through mental health services and social supports. And so I don't want to suggest that a cash transfer is to replace those other important social supports, to replace those employment services, to replace the housing supports. It's got to be complementary. It will go a long way to lifting people out of poverty, which is ultimately going to make a really significant long-term difference.
Yeah, and I think that the discussion you had around poverty and the one that you chaired, I thought it was a great discussion. I look forward to the next one because I think these are the things that we need to start talking about. But I 100% agree with you that that child care benefit, amazing things, and it's continuing to do amazing things. This is something that I'd like to explore further and always explore those ideas. But I just want to make sure that the money's going into people, going into children, going into what they need, going into for food security, as opposed to feeding addictions. And that's where, just coming from the community that I come from, is a challenge.
To that, I think one challenge you face with as you layer conditions onto payments is you layer on bureaucracy, and you don't always know what is best in comparison to people on the ground. And so if food vouchers could be one thing, but if the family really needs a particular article of clothing instead, or particularly needs a particular prescription drug instead, then we start to make decisions that maybe are not the best, in a way that the household leaders themselves are best placed to make those decisions. But I think it's really important to recognize challenges, and there will be increased challenges if you increase the inflow of dollars into someone with a substance use disorder. They're going to use it in a way that is probably harmful to their own interests, and we have to find a way of addressing that. And I think there are probably other wraparound services and other ways of reforming our drug laws that will ultimately get us there. But I take your point about needing to address these concerns head on as we develop any sort of long-term social expansion of our social safety net. I got to ask, so you go to law school, you get elected. How old are you?
40.
Get out of here. You're 40 years old? You look like you're 30. Okay. All right.
No, graduated Dal Law 2004. Started working at Cape Breton University as a professor 2005.
Okay. So you are out of law school, you're a professor, you run and you become the first Mi'kmaq member of parliament. You immediately take on the role of Liberal Indigenous Caucus chair. And I personally think you've been very eloquent at the microphone in your caucus interventions. Are there particular issues that you got involved to really drive through? And are they Indigenous issues because you took on the Indigenous Caucus chair, or other issues? Are there one, two, if you retire or are unelected at some point in your life and you look back and you say, well, you know what, I did this. What is the thing you want to accomplish in Ottawa?
My background, I've had 20 years. I was on the Assembly of First Nations National Youth Council as a chair of their organization back when I was 24, 25. I was involved with the executive during what I feel was like just the greatest moment for growth under Paul Martin, that had him, going to Kelowna Accord and settling the residential schools. And I thought that, being a part of that just really always kind of set me as a trajectory of Indigenous leadership. And I always wanted to be a part of that. And I always wanted to be a part of the conversation of finding some of the solutions. And if we're ever at a point where I'm a member of parliament when we pass UNDRIP, that will be a major proud thing for me and my family on that. But also, the Mi'kmaq won back in 1999 a Supreme Court of Canada's decision saying they had a right for a moderate livelihood fishery. And in September 17th, they won that case. And in the first time in the history of the Supreme Court of Canada, they had a clarification that came 2 months later, and saying that, the Mi'kmaq have a right to commercial fisheries, but it's got some limits to that. And they spent the first 5 paragraphs, the Supreme Court did, saying that they didn't need to clarify the decision, and then spent the remaining 50 paragraphs clarifying the decision. And so for 20 years the Mi'kmaq have been negotiating this, and it's one of these things that I'd like to see movement on. And I've had many good conversations with the chiefs, Minister Jordan, on this, and just trying to get this through. It's kind of odd that a community goes to the Supreme Court of Canada, wins a right, but then has to negotiate that right with the very people who were litigating against them. And if you talk about systematic racism, you talk about the inherent problem with that. And I'd love to see the Mi'kmaq be able to come to an agreement during this time that ensures that they're able to grow their fisheries, that they're able to add to the economy, that they're able to employ more people, that they're able to raise people out of poverty in these communities.
For a non-Indigenous person in Ottawa, I have spent a considerable amount of advocacy early on in the last parliament focused on clean water issues. And then I was part of a caucus working group focused on our child welfare system because I thought that was the gravest injustice that the government was yet to focus their efforts on in a serious way. And then we have seen legislation, we've seen additional funding to address that as well. And I'm now most focused on urban Indigenous issues here in Toronto. Here in Ontario, we see over 80% of Indigenous people live off reserve in our municipalities and in our urban centers, and we don't see enough of a focus, I think, in many respects, in terms of funding supports and government attention on our urban Indigenous communities. So I've tried to find a way to be an advocate and support existing social service providers and advocates here in Toronto and beyond. I wonder, though, what your advice would be for whether for a non-Indigenous member of Parliament or just a non-Indigenous Canadian about how we can best support the reconciliation effort.
I think it's all about creating awareness of that history and what has led people away from reserves and into urban locations. And one of the groups that I think does some great work is the Friendship Centers. The last thing I wanted to just touch on, though, you talk about economic racism a bit, and one of the things that I've been noticing is just the media coverage when dollars go to Indigenous programming. I was interested when I was looking at some of the national headlines. Minister Miller would get up and say these things, and then 3 weeks later he would say something, and I looked at the headline and it said, more money for Indigenous Services Canada, or another 60 million for Indigenous communities. And I never saw that when they were talking about seniors or disabilities or students. No one ever said more money for them.
I would say part of my drive for, a guaranteed income supplement kind of program for more Canadians beyond seniors is we see the disproportionate effect of poverty in Indigenous Black communities and historically discriminated against communities. And so there are negative consequences today for communities because of intentional negative policies throughout our history. But I would say anyone living in poverty, regardless of background, they're a vulnerable population, and we should be supporting them and lifting them out of poverty. And so the advantage of a program in some respects that isn't focused on one community or another, but is going to address disproportionate effects of those communities is when you say, let's move forward together, it is a very useful way of lifting everyone up, regardless of background, and moving forward together.
Yeah, and because no one chooses to be born into poverty.
Exactly.
And that's the thing, is that, this isn't their choice. I mean, there may have been mistakes that their parents or grandparents made along the journey, or maybe they just were given a raw deal from the start. But yeah, I agree 100% that no child, no matter what background, should not be given support and the opportunities that everyone else gets in Canada. And that's the biggest thing that I will agree with you 100%, is that we have to help children in poverty. And that's where I like where our Canada Child Benefit is. And I think that we can do better, but I really think that it's the focus, is making sure that children growing up have every opportunity that everyone else has. And I know that social circumstances at home are never going to be the same around the board, but as long as they're given the access to that opportunity and the ability to enjoy the life that most Canadians enjoy, I think that's important. And I agree with you 100% on that we need to do stuff on that.
Well, Jaime, I appreciate you taking the time. I got to say, it's been nice in many respects to see an influx of new members and the passion of new members and the drive for new members to make change. So I'm looking forward to working with you in this parliament, as we slowly but surely maybe resume some sense of normalcy in the fall.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. And I really appreciate you making time to have this conversation. It's important. And I look forward to seeing you in Ottawa.
Sounds good. Thanks, Jaime.